Okay, how about that?
Oh.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so we got to shape up. Uh, This meeting is being recorded. Um, I'm gonna get started and just assume that maybe a few more people will pop in as we go along. The last week's class focused on Poe's lifetime, 1809 to 1849. The class, the presentation this week is the century after Poe's death. So it literally, why do I have to admit people? I need to figure out how to stop admitting people. I mean, not stop admitting people, but I don't,
Let them come automatically.
they should come in automatically. Yeah, where's the,
Andy, can you tell them how to do that?
What?
How to let people come in automatically?
Well, I think there's a setting that allows you to,
okay, now I've done it. I got rid of the waiting room.
Okay.
Good.
So Sarah just jumped in. So anyway, as I was saying, the presentation this week focuses on the century from Poe's death until the middle of the 20th century. And what I'm trying to do here, and it may seem completely dubious, but is to use a few of Poe's texts as a way of suggesting how he anticipated a lot of the compelling fears of the modern age. And so the class today, I don't know how many of you had an opportunity to read the text for today. The first one I'm going to talk about, yeah, good for Anne, is The Man of the Crowd, a Poe tale from 1840 that he wrote just on the cusp of starting to write detective stories. And you can see that in The Man of the Crowd, which is a simple narrative in a sense about a narrator who's sitting in a coffee shop in London watching the crowds go by. And then he spots a strange looking character and he can't figure out where this character comes from. He doesn't fit any of the categories that the narrator is working with. He follows him into the street, pursues him for 24 hours. And at the very end of the tale, he said, "This old man is the type and genius of deep crime. He refuses to be alone." So it's a story that was very much influenced by Charles Dickens. Poe had been reading the early Dickens sketches by Boz. And I think it's also influenced in some ways by his own memory of London and the streets. And Poe had seen them for a while from 1815 to 1820. I'm going to create a time when we can talk about this. So if you have read that, if you have any questions, you might just make a note or just remember what you want to jump in and ask. And the second text from Poe that will figure in this is a poem, and not a very long poem. And if you found the link to The City in the Sea, there are two versions of it, an early one from 1831, and then a later version that includes a particular line that I want to focus on. So I'm saying, look at version 2, the version that talks about death looking gigantically down. Oh yeah, great line. Wow,
Yeah.
creepy. It's so Poe-esque.
Oh, that's amazing.
And then the third text, which we'll get to at the end, and I hope there will be time, is an 1839 text that's another one of those spiritual dialogues where Poe imagines two angelic spirits just, kind of hanging out and chatting. The topic here is not only, hey, things have changed a lot since you died, but The topic is the cause of death, which in that particular story is the end of the world. And Poe is building on all of the excitement in the 1830s being stirred up by Reverend William Miller, who was the founder of the Adventists, but he was leading a sect that believed the end of the world was going to come in sometime between 1843 and 1844. So there was a lot of end of the world anxiety. Just think back to Y2K. You know, there are certain moments when we think, oh my gosh, the world's going to end. So anyway, I'm here. I'm going to jump into the PowerPoint and we'll take off. And please let me know if you see this. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Good. Okay. All right. So this is this begins with Poe's death, and that is the first obituary. It was written by a nasty person named Rufus Griswold, who was actually at one time a colleague of Poe on Graham's magazine, but also a rival, and it turned out a pretty nasty enemy. And he used the occasion of Poe's death to say that the news of his death will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. He had few or no friends. And in other writings, Griswold spread the story that Poe was a madman who walked the streets raving, and yet at the very same time, Griswold was in the process of creating the first significant edition of Poe's complete works. He was a kind of literary industrialist. I've included here the famous quote from Sarah Helen Whitman, just to kind of recapture the doubt that Poe carried with him through his life. I showed you the angelic dialogues and the talk about Eureka last time, but Sarah Helen Whitman said, the unrest and faithlessness of the age culminated in him. So Griswold's edition came out in 1850, and very soon after that, Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, began publishing his translation of Poe in French. The very first work that Baudelaire ever translated was the one we looked at last week, Mesmeric Revelation. So that began a period of debate and controversy about Poe's importance. There were many who were eager to argue that Poe was a morally contemptible character, a drunk, someone who did not understand sort of the need to make a moral point in everything you write. Poe's friends and defenders pointed to his literary genius, and the debate raged on and on. And I call this a century of controversy because indeed it took about 100 years for Poe to come out from under this cloud of controversy and take a place as one of our major American authors. That is a picture of the Poe Memorial in Baltimore, where the Poe taster used to leave some cognac on Poe's birthday every year. I just want to make the point, you'll love this. Poe is a permanent Presbyterian because that grave is in Westminster Presbyterian Cemetery in Baltimore. So the scholarship on Poe began in the later 19th century. The first biography appeared in 1878. Others appeared before the end of the century. And there was certainly a lot of ambivalence on the part of the early biographers about what to make of Poe's personal life, of his uh, unbelief, of his apparent immorality. Uh, and yet there was an undeniable recognition of his brilliance, his originality, his genius. One of the sort of interesting indexes of Poe's not quite making it in American culture is that the very popular game, which you probably played in childhood, Authors, uh, which was created by Parker Brothers. Poe was not in the deck, never was. Instead, that deck featured Hawthorne, Irving, um, uh, uh, Alcott, and Longfellow, much to Poe's chagrin, posthumous chagrin. By the early 20th century, filmmakers were actually starting to gravitate to Poe's work. Among the earliest, somebody who actually had a fixation on Poe, unfortunately, was the filmmaker D.W. Griffith. I'll come back to Griffith in a bit because his Birth of a Nation in 1915, a silent film about the South, actually had pretty dire consequences in American culture. Another early filmmaker was Jean Epstein in France. He produced La Chute de la Maison Usher in French in 1928, and you can Google that and watch it. It's one of the creepiest Poe films ever made. It's very surreal. The Poe Centennials, 1909, 1949, seem to signal a kind of rehabilitation of Poe's reputation. That statue in the upper right actually is in the main reading room at Alderman Library at the University of Virginia. It was placed there in 1909 to mark the fact that Poe was a student at the university for 1 year in 1826. In 1949, I love this. I used to be a stamp collector. They issued a commemorative stamp for Poe's 100th anniversary of his death. And you'll notice that below the picture of Poe, it says the death of Edgar Allan Poe. Middle name, misspelled. That's the litmus test in my American Lit classes when I was teaching Poe. If students could spell his middle name, they could pass. So I'm going to move now to and just blithely skip over a very turbulent decade, the 1850s. And that could take 20 minutes to talk about all by itself. But obviously it was the decade in which the United States moved toward the Great Civil War that began in 1861. I've described this as moving toward a culture of fear. And one of the most important elements of this, what I'm trying to suggest is that as a result of the accumulation of media resources, people became conscious of death in new ways in the next century. No longer was death simply a reality that one experienced within the family or within the community. That gradual process of figuring out what death is that we all go through from our first consciousness of death in early childhood to our gradual realization of its implications for us. By the middle of the 19th century, we get the beginning of media that are capable of giving us a much richer and more powerful idea of the presence of death. The Civil War, well, there was for many years, 620,000 was the sort of the official count for deaths in the Civil War, but a historian, Gaines probably knows this, David Hacker, I think his name is, uh, did a study of census reports and critiqued the methods for estimating battle casualties and came up with a bigger number of 750. It was a war that saw the introduction. Yeah, did you have a comment, Gaines? Oh, he's not there. So the new technology of the war included rifles that, as opposed to muskets, rifles were incredibly more effective with a much longer range, greater accuracy, and they started using mini balls, which allowed them to load rifles much more rapidly. And then the war saw the introduction of repeating rifles, submarines, balloons for surveillance, Gatling guns, the kind of hand-cranked precursor of machine guns, and telegraphs, which became incredibly useful for getting messages immediately that signaled enemy movements or possible attacks. All of this, the reality of the war, became more familiar to non-combat citizens, thanks to the magazines and newspapers of that era. And of course, Matthew Brady established his great reputation in large part as a photographer of Civil War spectacles, especially the battles of Antietam, which is pictured here, and the Battle of Gettysburg. And the technique of lithography allowed the illustrated magazines to produce fairly compelling images of battle action for readers at home. The casualties of the Civil War also created the problem of what to do with the bodies. As you see in this image, many of the bodies remained on the battlefield for a long time, but it was felt that this was a great disrespect to those who had fallen. Gettysburg was, I mean, that's really one of the themes of Lincoln's address, the need to honor the dead. And this created the need to embalm the bodies in order to get them to the hometowns instead of leaving them to die in a, to rot in a field or to be thrown into a common grave. And this was the beginning of embalming in the United States on a major scale. And it led very quickly in the decades after the Civil War to a new relationship to death, to the funeral industry. Lincoln's death, of course, was one of the great spectacles of this era. Sort of at the very end of the war, Lincoln's death was a kind of culmination of all the deaths that the war had brought. And it was turned into a multi-day funeral that extended from Lincoln's death, I'm remembering now, April 9th, I think it was, 1865. He was not buried until early May in Illinois, and his body, as you well know, I think, was taken by train from Washington to Baltimore to Philadelphia to New York, and then west to be buried in Illinois. Walt Whitman's "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." If you don't know that poem, it's a really powerful literary response to the spectacle of the Lincoln funeral train moving through the landscape. And Whitman connects the death of Lincoln with the blossoming of lilacs and a star in the western sky and a bird singing. The Civil War really left its mark on literature for many years in a sort of unexpected way. the Civil War figures in Emily Dickinson's poetry. She was most prolific in her career during the years 1861 to 65. There's something about, and there were many, many soldiers from her hometown of Amherst, Massachusetts, who were brought home for burial during these years. There are very few Dickinson poems where the Civil War is evoked in even the most oblique way. Not one of all the purple hosts who held the flag today. I'm reaching for the lines, but it's in the poem "Success is Counted Sweetest." There is quite a direct reference to the Civil War and how the losers understand success best. Ambrose Bierce was very much influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, and his belated Civil War story, Chickamauga, is a frightening story told from the point of view of a young child who wakes up and starts crawling across a field, and we gradually come to understand that he's crawling over bodies. It's a really frightening story. Now moving into the later 19th century, and here I'm going to pause a little bit in a minute to talk about the man of the crowd. So, if you have any questions, please bring those up. This was a period of great violence all over the country. Gaines is an expert in Reconstruction, and so this is potted history in its worst form, but I'm simply trying to tell a story of the violence of an era in which the nation was actually put back together. I have cribbed the phrase "the White Republic" from Edward Bloom's book that was published by, is it Bloom? It may not be. Anyway, it was published by LSU Press, and it makes a powerful case for how, after the Civil War, the most urgent political and social and cultural action going on was knitting together the country on the basis of race, reestablishing a kind of white solidarity in which the freed slaves were instantly turned into second-class citizens, and a whole set of laws were cooked up in order to circumscribe their rights. The Jim Crow era, second slavery. This was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, of lynchings in the South. There's a great prejudice toward, on the basis of race and even mixed race, and that became one of the great subjects of a writer of mixed race, Charles Chestnut, who wrote brilliantly in the last decades of the 19th century. This was a period in which the cities grew quickly. Big cities grew in America by 15 million in the span of 20 years, but there was plenty of urban violence. There were lots of riots that involved attacks by nativists on immigrant groups. I talked a little bit about this last time. Workers fought with police. That is the theme in both of these images. The top one from 1874 shows an ethnic group of, I think, mostly German workers in New York City who were gathering to demand some kind of government help during the Panic of 1873 and the terrible hardships that everyone was facing. They're being driven away by mounted police. The image below is from 1886 from Chicago, from the Haymarket riot, in which workers were uh, trying to stage a protest in order to secure 8-hour workdays. And that erupted in violence and bombings. And so you get the picture of a lot of uncertainty in cities. Uh, and in the process, as I mentioned, this rebuilding of a white republic went on inexorably. Racism and xenophobia were on the rise. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was a response to the influx of Chinese immigrants, especially in the West, who had come to help build the railroad, although they went into many, many other uh, jobs and so forth in the West, not strictly railroads. The kind of the irony of this era is that we put up the Statue of Liberty in 1885, 86. It was shipped to us from France, a gift of France, and assembled and became a great emblem of an immigrant nation. But at the very same time, people were railing against the alien horde that was arriving on Ellis Island. And it wasn't many years after the erection of the Statue of Liberty that we began to see the rise of eugenics. Actually, that had already happened in England with Francis Dalton, but it spread to the US in the later 19th century and really caught fire. One of the consequences was that testing was imposed on Ellis Island to weed out the morons, the unfit, the undesirable. There was a great study in the 1890s that came out by Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives, in which he pictures immigrant ghettos. So I proposed the man of the crowd to kind of provide a keynote for this moment in American history. And I'm gonna try this. See if I can do this. Yes, here it is. Can you see that text? Anyone?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, this is near the beginning of Poe's tale, The Man of the Crowd, which begins, "It was well said of a certain German book that it does not allow itself to be read." I want to scroll down here. You see in the opening paragraphs, he's creating categories to explain the passersby. This is very much in anticipation of Sherlock Holmes, because he's very often able to figure out the vocation of someone by a slight smudge on a sleeve. And then comes this very interesting moment. With my brow to the glass, I was thus occupied in scrutinizing the mob when suddenly there came into view a countenance, that of a decrepit old man, some 65 or 70 years of age, a countenance which at once arrested and absorbed my whole attention on account of the absolute idiosyncrasy. Oh, there's a typo. I've got to report that. Anything even remotely resembling that expression I had never seen before. I well remember that my first thought upon beholding it was that Wretch, and he was a German painter at the time, had he viewed it, would have greatly preferred it to his own pictorial incarnations of the fiend. As I endeavored, and then he talks about the contradictory impressions that this figure creates for him. And he says to himself, what a wild history is written in that bosom. And then he develops this absolutely ferocious yearning to solve a mystery, to jump into the crowd and to follow this guy and to see what he can learn. He bases his suspicion in part on what he sees in the next paragraph. See if you buy this. His clothes generally were filthy and ragged, but as he came, now and then, within the strong glare of a lamp, I perceived that his linen, although dirty, was of beautiful texture. And my vision deceived me, or through a rent in a closely buttoned and evidently second-handed roquelaire which enveloped him, I caught a glimpse both of a diamond and of a dagger. And so we're off. And for the next 24 hours, this narrator follows this decrepit old man through the streets of London, often following the stranger as he plunges into crowds, but then again, following him down, excuse me, dark, empty streets. Now, I don't know how many of you had a chance to read this story. You can unmute yourself and fess up if you did. if you have any questions or observations, I guess the question I want to pose is, what do you make of the man of the crowd? It's a tough question to answer because the man of the crowd never speaks. And in fact, I can ask another question. Do we ever see the man of the crowd doing anything remotely criminal?
No, he does enter the Temple of Intemperance.
Yeah, he goes into the gin house,
Yeah.
right?
But yeah, nothing. Yeah.
Nothing at all. And this story has always fascinated me. It's very often read in the context of a sort of overarching comment, quoting David Reisman's book, The Lonely Crowd, which came out in the early 1950s and established the paradox that the most intensely concentrated population areas can create the greatest sense of solitude. And so there's a fascination here with this urban world that is beginning to emerge in the middle of the 19th century. Poe publishes his story in 1840, but certainly as the century goes on, as cities get bigger and bigger, many of these themes become more apropos. What I would suggest, and I'll just throw this out, is that you read this story very carefully and ask whether the stranger is revealing evidence of criminality or whether he is more likely revealing evidence that he knows he's being followed. It changes the whole story. It changes the entire story. Once you take into account the possibility that this is not a story about criminality, but a story about stalking. And what strikes me as typical or significant about this story is that we get the urban crowd, the masses. We get a narrator who sets himself up as the detective in waiting. And what he tells us about the old man creates for the reader a whole set of suspicions. This is fake news. This is disinformation. He is setting up the narrative that there is something profoundly twisted about this old man. And the process of demonizing him begins literally with the line, where he compares the old man to a painting of the devil. So I'll just lay that out there for your consideration, and flip back if I can to the PowerPoint. Okay. Now I want to go through this fairly quickly. This is, I guess, part 3 of a 4-round bout between science and religion. And obviously the period after the Civil War is the one where Darwin's Origin of the Species really changes the terms of the argument. No longer can religion and science sort of comfortably align themselves with each other on the basis of an idea of a providential world and a well-ordered creation and a chain of being, because Darwin gives us a new way of thinking about nature and the relationship between one species and another, and gives us the concept of evolution through adaptation and the principle of natural selection. Herbert Spencer very quickly assimilated Darwin in his principles of biology. And it was Spencer who devised the phrase, the survival of the fittest, to talk about social Darwinism. And this became, especially for the writers of the later 19th century, those who were drawn to realism, and then to the even more skeptical literary form of naturalism, this became a way of thinking about human beings in a social context. And the novels in the latter part of the 19th century are very much naturalistic and infused by a kind of Darwinian consciousness of this very grim survival struggle that is at the basis of creation, at least from the Darwinian scientific perspective. Thomas Huxley, a biologist at Oxford, became a champion of Darwin, had a famous debate with Samuel Wilberforce, who challenged him, "Mr. Huxley, are you willing to admit this day that you are descended from apes?" It's a tough moment for Huxley, but he said, "Well, at least I'm not descended from an idiot like you." And anyway, I don't think that changed anybody's minds, but Huxley championed the idea of agnosticism as an intellectual method, and that became very pervasive and influential across the whole range of scientific fields that were emerging in the late 19th century, including thermodynamics, molecular chemistry. Andy, you can probably jump in here and correct me, but I think this is when we get the periodic table established. We also get a whole range of wonderful inventions in the later 19th century that seem to establish the authority of science to legitimize the kind of reverence that science begins to command in popular culture. With the tube system in London came into being not long after, actually just before the Civil War, I believe. The transatlantic telegraph also, I think that was about the same time, around 1859. The phonograph a little bit later in the century, the telephone, electric lights, and finally, even before the 19th century is over, the automobile. Now, this side of the ledger accounts for the reactions of religious folk, or in the sphere of religion. And one of the most influential books to appear was a collection of essays by Anglican theologians called Essays and Reviews, in which they completely embrace the higher criticism and among other things, show that the Pentateuch could not have been written by Moses, and that the Psalms were not, certainly not all of them, written by David. And sort of this undermining continued through the 19th century, but by the time we get to the latter half of the century, the conflict between science and religion is more and more overt and abrasive. And in 1871, a professor in a medical school, William Draper, published a book, The History of the Conflict Between Science and Religion, in which he lays out the history of the war between science and religion, and he calls it the tyranny of religion, as a positive impediment to scientific progress. So we're in a different space than we were in the 18th century, when deists tried to reconcile an idea of God with the principles of natural law. Matthew Arnold published a famous poem in 1867. Those of you who have taught English or been in an English classroom probably came across Matthew Arnold's poem, Dover Beach, in which he famously said, "The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar." And in 1882, Nietzsche, in his book, The Gay Science, proclaimed the death of God, famously, and that gets quoted again and again. Religion fired back, responded, and the Moody Bible Institute, sort of a bastion of fundamentalism, opened in 1886 and began to battle higher criticism, to reject it entirely and to insist on a literal reading of the Bible. And one of the things that we see in the early 20th century is a roaring return of fundamentalism, which was getting squashed in the middle of the 19th century. It comes back strong. Well, this brings us to the second Poe text, and I don't intend to spend a lot of time with it, but it's the poem, The City and the Sea. The salient lines I have here: "Lo, death has reared himself a throne in a strange city lying alone far down within the dim west, where the good and the bad and the worst and the best have gone to their eternal rest." And then later in the poem, we get these lines: "Well, from a proud tower in the town, death looks gigantically down." This idea of death sitting on a throne, being a deity or a king, a ruler, becomes for Barbara Tuchman in 1966 the perfect emblem for her study of the run-up to the Great War, World War I. And she drew the title and the epigraph directly from Poe's The City in the Sea. That's a wonderful book, and I mean, she wrote several others on World War I, but that was a famous book, and it drew heavily on Poe because his poem aptly captures the feeling that exists in a culture where so many people are being killed in battle that it does seem that death has taken over and looks gigantically down on the whole scene. The Great War was the deadliest in human history, and these are cliches, and you know, these figures are obviously not precise, but they're estimates, and historians, you know, have argued about these numbers, and there have been any number of studies that, you know, attempts to refine, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the most important ideas that I and I can't even remember where I read this, but some historian remarked that more people died in the Great War than had died in all wars fought on the planet up until that moment, which is stunning. And I don't know how you would begin to document a statement like that, but I'll just throw it out there for what it's worth. Probably not a lot, but it's a very striking observation about how, if you think back to the Civil War, which for Americans seemed, a terrible bloodbath, and the deaths were somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000. And here we're talking about millions. And in addition to the 8,000 combat deaths and 2 or 3 or million combat deaths, the non-combat military deaths and the civilian deaths, we have additional deaths from Spanish flu, which influenced all of the previous 3 categories. Spanish flu is supposed to have killed 50 million people in 1918-19, which seems astonishing when we were, in the midst of a pandemic ourselves. And I tried to imagine what it would be like if we were in the middle of a war where millions of people were dying at the same time. That's inconceivable to me. So I mean, we feel we're in the worst moment historically that's ever been, but here's some perspective on what was going on in World War I. It was a terrible war for many reasons. New weapons were introduced. Submarines, well, we had submarines of a sort in the Civil War, but now they become strategic attack weapons capable of crossing the Atlantic Ocean, capable of bringing down steamships. We have the introduction of airplanes, dropping bombs, tanks, wonderfully effective weapons of mass destruction, and poison gas, the insidious new killer that was introduced especially to solve the problem of how to win a war that devolved into trench warfare. After the initial battles of 1914, 1915, trenches were dug across the entire perimeter of the north, the northeast, and the east of France, and battle lines moved very little. Instead, the war produced battles of attrition. In 10 months, the Battle of Verdun led to the deaths of 715,000 men. So Scott Fitzgerald in his first novel, This Side of Paradise, ends with this comment about his generation. Here was a new generation shouting the old cries, learning the old creeds, grown up to find all gods dead, harkens back to Nietzsche, all wars fought, all faiths in man shaken. And of course, that's the sort of bleak attitude that we get in the so-called lost generation of writers in the next decade. This is kind of a summary slide, and I want to go through it quickly if I can. But it helps to explain what I mean when I talk about a culture of fear that is beginning to develop. And its development has a lot to do with mass media, with new ways of making people aware of the broader world around them. The life expectancy in the US went up from 40 years at the time of Poe's death. And you'll notice he lived exactly as long as he should have for the early 19th century. It went up to 68 in 1949. It's now up to, I think, 78 point something. But the paradox, as Philippe Ariès has pointed out, or Ernest Becker, excuse me, is that with longer lives, people develop greater anxiety about dying. If you know you're going to die young, it's a familiar thing. It's something kind of in your immediate expectation. You get more time to worry if you live longer, and more anxieties are developing in this strange culture we live in. Anxieties about the environment, anxieties about technology, anxieties about biology, about epidemics, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is part of the culture of fear. Now, Arias says that around 1900, death starts to become invisible. So after a period in which death is sort of celebrated and dramatized as the beautiful death, we get new customs and practices. Dying becomes institutionalized. People start dying in hospitals, in rest homes, old age homes. Funerals are outsourced. People are no longer cared for. Bodies are no longer cared for at home by their loved ones. They are no longer prepared for burial by loved ones and placed in a coffin by loved ones. Instead, they are taken to a funeral home where their bodies are prepared, not placed in a coffin, but placed in a very expensive casket. Burial becomes commodified. Mourning becomes diminished. The elaborate displays of mourning of the early and mid 19th century completely disappear in the early 20th century. Yes, you wear a black dress or a black suit to a funeral, but you don't wear a band. You don't put a sign on your door, et cetera, et cetera. And starting with England around 1900, there is a very rapid transition to cremation as the preferred mode of disposing of the dead. This was very pervasive in Britain in the early 20th century. It has become pervasive in the US, I would guess, mostly in the last 20 to 30 years. And we could spend time talking about why people prefer cremation now. It's handier, it's more environmental, but it also gets rid of a lot of the pain of funerals, unless of course people have an actual funeral in a brick and mortar funeral home and are then cremated. But cremation, raises some very interesting questions about our relationship to death and our thinking about the resurrection of the body. World War I exposed a lot of doubt about old values and moral codes. This was exactly the point of Fitzgerald's quote that I had on the previous slide. And for a period of time, the world wars undermined the denial of death. How can you deny the presence of death when bodies are piled up? The presence of death on the battlefront created such a powerful psychological effect that treatment for shell shock became pervasive in World War I, continued in World War II, and of course we all know about PTSD, which is what we call it now. But as soon as the war is over, there's a very interesting phenomenon that takes place. After this trauma of war, there's a kind of post-war exuberance, an explosion of energy, of dance, the roaring 20s, the jazz age, exuberance and forgetting, trying to put into the back of your mind all that has been experienced during the war, which is a very natural human response, but it does get us back to denial. So we have the psychology, and this is one of the themes in Frank Ferretti's book, How Fear Works, that I'll talk more about next week. But Ferretti sees psychology emerging in the aftermath of World War I as a powerful, influential force in human culture. The treatment of shell shock uh, uh, evolves into a fascination with the psychology of victimhood, the various ways that human beings are traumatized, sexual trauma, etc. And it leads to an attitude, at least according to Fioretti, in which anxiety itself is perceived as an illness, not an absolutely human emotion, a natural response, but an illness in that psychology can help us to overcome. Uh, and Fioretti says it creates in the 20th century a culture preoccupied by risk avoidance. Now, on the religious side of the ledger here, we get, toward the end of the 19th century, there's a great surge in fundamentalism, hellfire and damnation. But as Fioretti notes, Christians become less attracted to, less responsive to the theology of fear, estranged from a fearful God. Um, and this loss of a notion of God's fearfulness curiously separates people from what Ferretti calls a moral grammar of meaning. This moral grammar of meaning gives fear significance. Fear of God, Fioretti writes, was increasingly displaced by an unfocused and therefore confusing and often meaningless force, the fear of fear itself. And a bit later, Fioretti comments, the fear of God became replaced by a fear of life. Cultural preoccupation, anyway, this gets us into the culture of fear and the fixation with our own vulnerability and the assumption that we're in an untenable situation wherever we are. So anyway, I'm going to rip through this slide. So much for the 20s. I'm running out of time here a little bit, and I do want to get to that last potail. And so after the war, we do get the explosion of energy, excitement, the roaring, reckless, but also very racist decade of the 1920s, which begins with the Red Scare, the pursuit of radicals, of foreign Bolsheviks, extremists, and ultimately this leads to the sensational, very divisive execution of Sacco and Vanzetti in 1927. This decade was rife with anti-immigrant hostility. The National Origins Act of 1924, that cartoon at the bottom, captures the effect. All of the people from Europe who want to come, the immigration is reduced to a trickle. The cartoon, Uncle Sam is holding a 3% label. My recollection is it was actually 2% in that National Origins Act, but they rolled back immigration quota numbers to 2% of what they were in 1890 to try to keep out foreigners. There was tremendous emphasis in the 1920s, very explicit public emphasis on the part of leaders, politicians, on being 100% American. That may sound familiar to you, but there was a great emphasis on pure Americanism. People from foreign countries were discouraged from identifying themselves as a hyphenated anything, Italian American, etc. You were an American, or being a pure American really required in this culture Anglo-Saxon origins, because at the very heart of it all was a ferocious desire to recreate that white republic. I mentioned D.W. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation. It immediately sparked a revival of the Ku Klux Klan, starting in Georgia, but spreading all over the country. And this second incarnation of the Klan was especially insidious because it used techniques of mass advertising and persuasion and very clever strategies to make the Klan look innocuous. Yes, they were carrying on all of the usual atrocities to keep people of color in their place, as people in the Klan like to say. Lynchings in the US, my recollection is that in 1919, there were 82 lynchings in the US. There were also public burnings, 24 of them between 1918 and 1921. Many of these public events where white citizens were called, were told to meet and to watch the public burning of a Black person. In this era, the Klan embraced the slogan, America First. And that was used many times in many ways by many people. Woodrow Wilson introduced it in 1916 to argue for isolationism. And it was revived by Warren Harding during his administration. And then, and I apologize for that image, I apologize for that element in our history, but that's what it is. That lynching, by the way, took place in Duluth, Minnesota. So this isn't a Southern thing. This is a national thing. That's the stupefying reality of that shocking image of the Ku Klux Klan marching down the street in Washington in 1925. The Klan had a national membership and a considerable amount of power in Congress. This was also a period in which everyone was getting excited about race theory. In the Saturday Evening Post, which Fitzgerald wrote for quite often, there were many, many articles touting the Nordic race. Fitzgerald satirizes this a bit at the beginning of The Great Gatsby when he has Tom Buchanan wanting to promote a book that is titled The Rise of the Colored People's Empire. The American Eugenics Society was founded in 1922. One of the founders was Madison Grant, who wrote a book called The Passing of a Great Race, which was a celebration of white supremacy. And the war between religion and science heated up, especially with the fundamentalists attacking science, attacking Darwinism. This led to the Scopes trial in Tennessee, where Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan faced off on whether Darwin should be taught to high school students. It's sort of a forgotten fact, but actually the Darwinian argument did not prevail. And yet it won in the larger court of public opinion, but not in Tennessee. It was a great period of fundamentalism, revivalism. Billy Sunday was immensely popular, and a woman evangelist, Amy Semple McPherson, I've got a picture of her standing there in an angelic robe. She became one of the first mega stars of sort of religion, American religion. And of course, prohibition, organized crime, and this leads to the stock market crash and the suicides of the 20s. And then the 30s, the Great Depression. I will just zip through this, but note that FDR's inauguration speech in 1933, when he insists that all we have to fear is fear itself. This is very much what Fioretti says evolves from the fear of God, becomes a fear of fear when culture becomes more secular. And all of this, I would point out, goes back to Roderick Usher. Not that he was the absolute source of this, but Roderick Usher is afraid, he says he has a fear of fear itself. In the decade of the 30s, there were many sources of fear. And curiously enough, it was the emergence of some great horror films. Bela Lugosi's Dracula, the Boris Karloff's Frankenstein, and then those two stars joined forces in a version of Poe's The Black Cat, which has, I want to assure you, nothing to do with the black cat, except there may be a black cat in it, but it has nothing to do with Poe's story. The radio was becoming a powerful media presence. And in 1937, there is the first live broadcast of a horrific spectacle, the explosion of the Hindenburg in New Jersey, reported live over the radio. And then, of course, the hoax, the War of the Worlds in 1938, that created a couple days of absolute panic on the East Coast at the news that an alien invasion was underway, and that Martian ships had landed in most of the states, most of the middle Atlantic states. Fascism was on the rise in Germany, Italy, Spain, England, and even the US. And here's a picture of Madison Square Garden in 1939, the German-American Bund, holding one of many rallies in that decade. Those rallies began at least as early as 1934. They may have started earlier than that. Yeah, in fact, I know I saw a reference to one in the 20s, but this one is particularly interesting because you see that they're trying to promote the idea that the first Nazi was, who is it? Right in the middle, it's George Washington. George Washington, the first Nazi. And there's a swastika just to Washington's left. There's a little video you can see, A Night at the Garden, that gives a pretty graphic account. The America First movement sort of metamorphosed again, and one of its public spokespersons was Charles Lindbergh, the great aviator, who was very keen to promote American isolationism and staying out of the war that was emerging in Europe. That began with Hitler's rise in Germany, Kristallnacht, the 1938 annexations of Austria, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia. Lindbergh was determined to be a friend of Germany and made speeches trying to keep the US out of the war. Lindbergh was himself a kind of a notorious anti-Semite, and he did, in fact, go to Germany and receive a medal directly from, I don't think it was Hitler, maybe it was Göring. So this brings us to World War II, and we know how this ends. That's the prefecture at Hiroshima. Sarah and I saw this last year. It's quite a sight. And there's a wonderful museum that allows you to see exactly the effect of an atomic bomb. The Second World War produced a completely new scale of death, 75 million. 75 million. It was provoked by exactly by the fascism and hypernationalism that was building in the 1920s and 30s. Nazi ideology leads to the Holocaust, and Japanese imperialism. Excuse me, I just ended my slideshow. Let me try that again. Yeah. Let me try that again. Let me go back to this. Yeah, so anyway, the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and by the way, if you go to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, they have an interesting account of this. Every Sunday school class has to have a Bible verse, so there's our inspiration for today from 2 Peter 3:10 on the end of the world. The day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a loud noise, and the elements will be dissolved with fire, and the earth and everything that is done on it will be disclosed. The last text that I wanted to look at very briefly is that of the conversation of Eros and Charmian. It was inspired by all of the comets of the 1930s, which included Halley's Comet in 1835. One was expected in 1839, but it turned out to be hard to see. But Poe was using it to stir up that end of the world anxiety that Reverend Miller had been speaking of and promoting for 8 or 9 years at that point. Poe gives us a futuristic account of the way the world changes in the face of this new, let me see if I can grab it here quickly. No, that's the wrong one. Let's see if this is it. Yeah. Can you see that? Hello? Can you see that screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Poe describes here an environmental catastrophe. A comet is approaching the Earth, changing the atmosphere, causing weird effects in plant life, and gradually changing the air that people breathe. Here's a paragraph that talks about the relationship between oxygen and nitrogen. One of the things that really interests me in this story is the way that the press, the mass media of that era, helped to excite anxieties about this impending catastrophe. And then it concludes with these lines: a furious delirium possessed all men, and with arms rigidly outstretched toward the threatening heavens, they trembled and shrieked aloud. But the nucleus of the destroyer was now upon us, even here in Aden, and that's Poe's word for heaven. Remember, this is an angelic spirit talking. I shudder while I speak. Let me be brief. Brief as the ruin that overwhelmed. For a moment, there was a wild, lurid light alone, visiting and penetrating all things. Then let us bow down, Charmian, before the excessive majesty of the great God. Then there came a shouting and a pervading sound, as if from the mouth itself of him, while the whole incumbent mass of ether in which we existed burst at once into a species of intense flame, for whose surpassing brilliancy and all fervid heat, even the angels in the high heaven of pure knowledge have no name. Thus ended all. And I use this story. I mean, obviously a comet is not an atomic bomb, but I think Poe anticipates the idea of a global existential threat. And it,
Whoa.
what? Yeah, it certainly meshes with the spectacle.
Comes the rain.
Pardon? Oh, okay.
Yep.
Glad, glad to glad to hear that. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I know people are getting ready to tune in to Patty and the service this morning. If any of you have any want to make any comments, unmute and go for it. I think I skipped over my last slide, which gives the stories for next week. Let me see if I can pull that up.
No, I thought they might have stepped in it.
The stories for next week are going to be Hop Frog. I just added that. It's a pretty it's a pretty shocking story for adult audiences. I'm also going to use The Sphinx, which is a kind of comic story about how you can be afraid of something that you shouldn't be afraid of. And finally, I'm going to close with Poe's poem, El Dorado. So
Your list of slides, list of stories didn't show. It was the previous slide.
yes,
I think I saw it at one point.
Yeah, there it is. Let me see if I can call that up. And now, I don't know why that won't advance. Probably I need to do that. And once it goes out of that mode, it just doesn't show it. Anyway, those are the stories for next week. And read The Sphinx. You probably don't have time to read all those, but read The Sphinx. The Hop Frog is a pretty hard story to read. And I use it to talk about the way that Poe anticipates the shock of terrorism. It really represents a pretty shocking spectacle, a spectacle that is created explicitly for political reasons to shock a certain population. So anyway, I hope I spent a little bit more time with the Poe this week. This is also shameful. We should be spending much more time talking about all this good stuff. But and I'm really curious to know, if you all have any questions or comments, feel free to email, and we'll carry on next week with the last. Let me see if I can put this up. Can you see that?
No.
No.
No. Okay, let me try to open this up. And there, can you see that?
Yes.
Hey, that's exactly the one. Oh. So anyway, Managing Fear in a Dark Time. That title keeps metamorphosing, and I'd love to have a bouncier, more upbeat approach. But I think if you read the Sphinx, especially in the context of the Masque of the Red Death, you'll see what Poe is getting at. It is entirely possible to misunderstand the likelihood or the scale or the perspective of any threat that you face. It can look a lot bigger than it really is. So anyway, that's all I got for this week, folks.
Thank
Give
you.
them
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Take care. Have a good week. Stay
Yeah.
safe.
All right, thanks. Bye.